Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the latest Campfire Chat organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. Today, we will be exchanging views on the governance of emerging climate-altering technologies, such as carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. We have a fantastic group of international experts with us to share their views on these issues and to answer questions you may have. And with this, I would just like to ask the speakers to turn on their video. I see Amy Luers is already there. If the others could turn on their video, thank you very much. So I will ask them in a few moments to introduce themselves, but just so that you all know, we have Thelma Krug from Brazil, who is about to turn her video on, Simon Nicholson of New Zealand, Amy Luers of the US, Saleemul from Bangladesh, and Arunabha Ghosh from India. But before that, I'd like to just share with you a few words about our initiative and about this Campfire Chat. So the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G, is a small foundation-funded initiative. Our mission is to catalyze the strengthening and the development of governance frameworks for climate-altering technologies and approaches like carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. It's important to note that we are impartial about whether or not they should be used, and if yes, which technologies are to be used, when, and to what extent. These are precisely the governance discussions that need to take place at the societal level. But we do wish to contribute to and even encourage societal conversations about these issues at domestic as well as international levels. The various webinars and campfire discussions we have initiated recently as part of our C2GLearn and C2G Discuss online activities will hopefully contribute to these conversations. And soon, other online activities will complement these. But before going any further, I would like to stop just for one moment and think about the wildfires in the Western United States, and of course in many other parts of the world that get perhaps less media attention. The impacts of the climate crisis are here today, and it is good to remind ourselves why we're here. We're here because of these impacts and because we're convinced that climate action is essential and urgent. But now, let's go back to our campfire chat. We will be exploring these emerging technologies and approaches that can alter the climate, such as large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. These are sometimes referred to as geoengineering, climate interventions, and even many other names. We will be discussing later on the issues of terminology and how the choice implies certain framings and approaches. During the next 90 minutes, we will explore why we need to bother even thinking about these emerging technologies, what they are, how they have impacts on the broader sustainable development landscape, how they might impact the most vulnerable, what might be the motivation of certain actors to pursue these, and hopefully many other issues depending on your questions. Before getting going with the discussion, however, I would like to remind us that the fundamental purpose of these campfire discussions is to explore different views and to understand that people have different views and why people have different views on these complex and often very controversial issues. So the purpose of our event is neither to convince each other about one view or another, nor to come out with a unanimous conclusion. Let's explore the different views, the richness of the debate, and hopefully we will all learn from this process. Now, what I'd like to suggest for this event is that I will now ask in a moment each person to introduce themselves, each of the speakers. Then we'll have a discussion amongst the speakers, maybe lasting about 20-30 minutes, depending on how the discussion goes. And in the meantime, I hope that all the participants will prepare questions and make those available on the Q&A tab of the Zoom app. That's where you should post your questions. And don't forget that if you already find a question that you like there, please vote for it, because the more votes a question gets, the higher chance that we will be able to address it during the time that we have. There is also the possibility to chat, and you're welcome to use that. But if you have a question, please put that under the Q&A tab and not under the chat. So once we have addressed all the questions, then we may have some last-minute reflections, and that will be the end of the chat. Now, maybe, as I said, then let me start by asking the experts, the international experts, to briefly introduce themselves. And before, maybe I should introduce myself as well to show a good example. So my name is Janos Pasztor. I am the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. And I've been working on climate change for about 4 decades. Wow, that's a lot. Okay. And obviously there is still some work to do, and that's why I am here. So Thelma, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Janos. I am Thelma Krug, and I am one of the 3 vice chairs of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So I am here in Brazil, in my home office now. Thank you.
Thank you, Thelma. Simon?
Thanks. I'm Simon Nicholson. I sit in Washington, D.C. I'm an associate professor at American University, and I co-direct 2 initiatives that touch on these climate-altering technologies, the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment and the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy.
Thank you, Simon. Amy?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Janos. Over the last 3 years, I've served as the Executive Director of Future Earth, where I also led the development of a new initiative, international initiative called Sustainability in Digital Age. Previously, I also served in the Obama White House working on climate resilience, and at Google working on similar issues. And a big focus across these different roles has been the role of science and technology to support global environmental governance. So thrilled to be here today with everybody.
Thank you, Amy. Saleem?
Thank you very much, Janos. I'm Saleemul Haq. Please call me Saleem. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, based at the Independent University Bangladesh in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where I'm speaking from. And most of my work is on looking at the impacts of climate change in the poorest, most vulnerable developing countries and how to help them adapt. So I'm not an expert in this subject, but I've come to learn about this subject from the other experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Saleem. And none of us are experts. We're all learning as it goes. So, Arunabha.
Thank you, Janos, and good day to everyone. I'm Arunabha Ghosh. I'm the CEO of an independent policy research institution called the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We're based in New Delhi in India, but have worked across India and in several emerging economies. I've been learning about climate engineering governance for about 10 years now. 10 years ago, I co-chaired the International Governance Working Group for the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative. Currently, I'm also co-chairing the Energy and Climate Change track for India's forthcoming science, technology, and innovation policy. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And as everybody, you can see, we have 5 excellent experts, colleagues who will share with us their views. And let's start. And I would like to start maybe asking a question from Thelma. And you know, take your time, 2-3 minutes to respond, whatever it takes. But can you share with us, Thelma, do we, or if yes, why do we need to talk about the governance of climate altering technologies? And why now? What does the science, the latest science, tell us about this? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janos. And now an official good morning to you, to the colleagues joining this Campfire Chat, and obviously those joining us today to have this very exciting discussion on multiple viewpoints on this topic of emerging climate altering approaches. Obviously, as I am participating as with my hat of vice chair of the IPCC, I will have to refrain from bringing my own personal views on this subject, right? So I have to be fair and honest to the assessment that has been made by the IPCC. And I think that this is a good point also to say, to make it clear, Janos, that you know, the IPCC does not do research on its own. So its responsibility or role is really to assess the scientific, technological, socio-economic information, which is relevant to understand the risk of human-induced climate change, potential impacts, and also options for adaptation, mitigation. And this assessment has to be comprehensive, transparent, open, objective. So when I say then that I cannot express my views, obviously what the IPCC publishes expresses the research that has been conducted worldwide. So IPCC is not prescriptive to any one of the options or approaches, but it needs to be policy relevant, and in doing so, it really transmits the updated scientific knowledge on these subjects. So that's interesting. So IPCC addressed, the first time I saw IPCC addressing, and that was under the umbrella of geoengineering that you introduced in your opening, was in the fifth assessment report, which was published in 2013 and 14. And that was under this umbrella of geoengineering. I thought it would be interesting to provide the definition that IPCC gives in the fifth assessment report, because I think it also frames the discussions we are going to have, because that the definition, although it's under geoengineering, the contents are still valid. So I would say that the geoengineering definition in the AR5 is that, this refers to a broad set of methods and technologies that aim to deliberately alter the climate system in order to alleviate the impacts of climate change. You were talking here about some methods that seek to either reduce the amount of absorbed solar energy in the climate system, as is the case with solar radiation modification, the so-called SRM, or also increase the net carbon sinks from the atmosphere at a scale sufficiently large to alter climate. And then within these, we put the carbon dioxide removal approach and the several options under it. But I would like to stress, and this is absolutely valid, that in the definition also, two key characteristics of the methods that are of particular concern are they use or affect the climate system, and that can be atmosphere, the land, and the ocean, globally or regionally, and or could have unintended effects that cross national boundaries. So I thought that, bringing these two aspects of concern are important because it frames the need for governance, which I hope to, provide at the very end of my intervention here, which is going to be short. In the most recent special report on 1.5, the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that was in 2018, there is a specific section when it says about this strengthening the efforts, to cope with climate change. And then both SRM, solar radiation modification, and CDR, the carbon dioxide removers, are introduced there, right? But separately. So we're not talking about geoengineering as we did in the AR5, because we understand that these two approaches to be in different levels of maturity, scientific maturity. So we separated them, but we provide the assessment for both of them as much as we could. So also these approaches can have different impacts, as I already mentioned, globally or regionally. Well, in the special report of 1.5, the role of carbon dioxide removal, in particular for this approach, became very apparent, because especially in those CO2 emission trajectories, which IPCC assessed in the report, how can we get to the end of the century, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels? And you see that there are many different trajectories that can lead us to that limit, right? But in some of these pathways, there is an exceedance in temperature above 1.5 temporarily, but then it has to be brought down to 1.5 to be a pathway consistent to 1.5 at the end of the century. So in doing, how can we do this? How can we bring it down? And then the CDR has a definite role, and in the most assessed literature, carbon dioxide removals, and in particular afforestation, reforestation, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, large scale deployment of these things, were in the assessed literature most specifically. Although these refer to basically two of the options that you have under carbon dioxide removal approach, right? But then it really says that the higher the overshoot, as we call it, the excedence in temperature beyond 1.5, and the longer it stays there, the more need of CDR we would need to have, right? And obviously, at large scale, CDR could have significant impacts on land, food, water security, ecosystems, biodiversity. So you have a range of potential impacts and risks that the IPCC in its assessment could not really pinpoint exactly, because we still have uncertainties on these things. Depends very much on where it goes. Anyway, so the modeled emission pathways that IPCC assessed did not include solar radiation modification, but the scientific literature already notes potential risks that would not be distributed equally in the globe, and that could affect, in particular, vulnerable regions. For instance, a change in precipitation and extreme events, there are some of the risks that have been indicated in chapter 4. So to finalize, and going to the answer to your specific question, Janos, there is a need to talk about governance of these climate altering approaches now. And I see that basically a little bit different, but then we can elaborate this more during our chat. But in particular for solar radiation modification, to avoid the risk of unilateral actions that could have negative effects across borders. So we are talking in particular about the engagement of developing countries, you know, the small islands, which could be severely affected by some of these approaches. And they need to hear their voices and their concerns. More than that, we also need to, through governance, stimulate more research on this. And when I talk engage and do more research, again, trying to be as comprehensive as possible and not be, you know, only developed countries and then developing countries, because you need this engagement. You need people to understand why these things are necessary. What are the risks? What does it take? How much it costs? For how long it has to remain you know, deployed. And this is one issue particular for the SRM. So we need to really have this more comprehensive vision of governance. Some of these approaches could, or options within these approaches, could be handled within national governance, but others, naturally, will need to be addressed under the more broader umbrella of an international governance. So I would stop here and hoping that I have, you know, planted some seeds for discussion and further elaboration by my friends here. Thank you very much, Janos.
Thank you, Thelma, and you've planted lots of seeds. And while the other colleagues will put water and fertilizer, I'm sure they will all come up. So, Simon, let's go to you, because actually it follows very nicely. Because Thelma, you threw out a couple of interesting words: geoengineering. Then, of course, the title of this event is climate altering technologies. There is carbon removal, solar radiation modification. There are others which haven't yet been mentioned, like nature-based solutions. And Simon, maybe you could help us why it is helpful or not helpful to talk about some of these, and how the choice of these words matter and what their implications may be. So over to you,
Yes.
Simon.
Thank you, Janos, and thank you, Thelma. Well, to try and cut through the terminological conversation that could get us bogged down, let me just try to make one, I hope, pretty straightforward point. And that straightforward point is there are lots of different climate altering approaches that we need to talk about that operate in lots of different ways at lots of different scales. Now, what all of these different climate altering approaches have in common is that they are responses to climate change, potentially, conceivably in the future. And so that means in governance terms, there is benefit in trying to look at these climate altering approaches alongside other traditional ways to think about and respond to climate change, that is mitigation or emissions abatement and adaptation to changes that are already baked into the climate system, right? And so step one, climate altering technologies and approaches should be thought about alongside traditional ways to think about and respond to climate change. But importantly, and beyond that, we have to think about the differences. Solar radiation modification and carbon removal are two different buckets that would work in the climate system in different ways to do very different things. And so that suggests in governance terms that those buckets might be thought about distinctly, separately. Then when we get into those buckets, there are lots of different approaches that operate in very different ways. And just taking any one approach, there are lots of different ways to implement or think about or do research around any single approach. Just to bring a point to that, think about something like afforestation, the planting of trees to try and draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There are lots of different ways to do that in lots of different places. And if we think about something like afforestation just in climate change terms, we might miss out on all of the other things that forests do for people and for the planet. And so the way that we think about, talk about, and imagine these different approaches really does matter for how they will materialize or not in the future. And to follow that afforestation example to its conclusion, the big governance questions are not at the highest level about whether trees can take carbon out of the atmosphere. The biggest governance questions are on the ground about implementation in particular places to particular benefits. So that's all I'll say at this point, Janos. Thanks for bringing me in.
Thank you, Simon. And there are a couple of seats here too, so we'll come back to that. But let's just continue for now. Can I turn to Amy? And I think Simon made the point, which is quite interesting, that there could actually be, and then sometimes there ought to be different objectives than just simply carbon. There's carbon, there's biodiversity, there's food security. There's a whole range of goals in the what's now been approved for 5 years ago, the Sustainable Development Goals. But how does one address these? How does these linkages work, and how does one address them through governance? Maybe you could help us to try to get a handle on this. So turn your mic on, please.
Apologies. Thank you, Janos. And great to be here. As you mentioned, as with so many governance challenges, climate altering strategies requires the balancing of trade-offs. And importantly, within the context of multiple perspectives and values of a diverse population. In particular, a key challenge, as Simon mentioned and you pointed to, the governance of climate altering strategies is ensuring that they are aligned with other sustainable development goals, such as biodiversity, food security, health, human rights. There are lots of examples where climate altering strategies, thinking about these trade-offs. I like to think about these in this context here, in the context of the nature-based strategies, afforestation, reforestation, and I would also put BECCS in there, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And part of the reason I'd like to focus in on those is that at the center of much of these is how we use our land, as you highlighted. The challenge is, if we think about the nature-based strategies for climate altering implications, we could end up managing our landscapes for carbon, rather than the multitudes of services that these need to provide for us. So making these choices is a value judgment, but it requires a full understanding of the implications of our decisions. And that's not always easy, because we often can't see the implications of our decisions. What is the carbon implication when we make a decision in Brazil? What is that implication for another place in the world? If we choose to deforest a place or not deforest a place in Brazil, it could have implications in China or in Bangladesh or in the US. And understanding those connections across a landscape and across the world isn't always easy, but it's becoming easier as the digital revolution is opening up new opportunities to see and understand the implications of our resource use in management decisions. There are lots of examples of this, from the expansive access to satellite imagery, to the rise of the Internet of Things, to the increasing diversity of using of AI, to be able to look at implications of our decisions at a much broader scale and in much more in real time. I believe these technologies will play a critical role in defining our success in governing the climate alternate strategies in the future. But if these are to be helpful, we need to start reimagining the our global environmental governance that in the digital age. Let me, to sort of unpack that a little bit more, let me start by talking about 3 critical risks and constraints with regard to nature-based carbon removal strategies, which require governance. One is related to permanence, the second is leakage, and the third is, again, putting together these critical trade-offs. Just a brief moment on each of these in terms of the terminology. So permanence refers to the concern that carbon stored in forest and other vegetation can quickly combust and be released back into the atmosphere. And we're acutely aware of this right now, my friends and family that are on the west coast of the US, and of course all of us globally, as we also experience this around the world, and most acutely, most recently also in Australia. So while forests can hold and absorb lots of carbon, they can also be released, that carbon back into the atmosphere quite quickly when something like fires emerge. The second issue is leakage. Leakage, this is a critical issue. This, as I pointed to before, is the issue that decisions that are made in places in the world have implications in other places. So research demonstrates clearly that afforestation and reforestation or reduction in deforestation in one location can trigger increased deforestation or degradation or harvesting in another, canceling out the benefits of carbon storage and forest protection in any given place. The third issue is just to reiterate this issue of trade-offs. The final challenge that I want to highlight here, but not the only other one that needs governance in dealing with these, is the trade-off on how land is used and managed. The simple way I like to think about this, as I highlighted before, is we don't want to manage our landscapes just for carbon sequestration. We need to balance carbon with biodiversity, food security, water, and other issues. For this reason, even though trees are one of the most efficient and low-cost approaches to absorbing carbon, we definitely do not want massive planting of any type of tree anywhere in the world. We need to consider the trade-offs, and these trade-offs ultimately come down to value decisions among a global and diverse population. Digital transformations are an opening up of new opportunities for climate governance in the context of these 3 areas, among others. A few examples of ways that of capabilities that we need to use as we rethink how we reimagine how we really structure our institutions for global environmental governance are the following. One is the unprecedented transparency at a planetary scale. Increasingly, the ability to see in near time carbon emissions opens up new opportunities to govern the leakage as well as inform the trade-offs and discussions. The second area is intelligent systems, not just AI systems, but collective intelligent systems that expand our ability to forecast hazards and vulnerabilities and thus govern the risks related to permanence issues. The third area that the digital revolution is allowing is mass collaboration. This allows the engagement of more direct and deliberative governance approaches to tackle trade-off decisions which have a huge equity and social justice concerns. I want to clarify here that I'm not saying that these digital enabled capabilities will solve the risks and constraints around the use of nature-based climate altering strategies. But what I would argue is that as technologies increase our ability to know where things are, how they are connected, to better anticipate where they are headed and enable communities more directly to collaborate, they open up opportunities for reimagining climate governance in the digital age. And today we have governance systems that were built within an analog world. While there are a number of areas where digital technologies are used to support the analog systems, what we really need to focus on is to tackle these challenges. We need to reimagine how we monitor, govern the natural world, and as they create new opportunities for understanding, managing the trade-offs and implications. Consider, for example, Climate Trace, which is a collaborative network recently announced that combines data access and analytical tools. It's seeking to combine that access and analytical tools to provide near real-time access for carbon emissions across all sectors. The goal is to have this, have advances of this by the next climate COP. This could have huge disruptions to the existing approaches to which we govern climate. But the big changes are not just the technology. What we need, if we're going to capture those and have them be effective, we need to think of institutions. So in sum, huge risks and opportunities lie ahead around efforts to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The digital age is constantly presenting new tools to help overcome some of these challenges of permanence, leakage, and trade-offs. But to address these, we cannot simply apply these tools to the old way of doing things. We need institutional shifts. We need to redesign our governance systems that we developed for the analog world of yesterday and start building our governance systems for the rapidly changing digital world of tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. That's super interesting about the analog and the digital worlds. We'll come back to that maybe. But coming to Saleem. Saleem, we just heard some interesting ideas from Simon, also Amy, really about multiple uses, multiple objectives, particularly focusing on land. And that's where a lot of the world's poor are. So maybe you could help us to look into this a little bit more in depth of how the vulnerable people and countries and regions could be most affected by these and what they should do about it. Over to you, Saleem.
Sure. Thank you very much, Janos, and thank you to the previous speakers for some very, very interesting and thought-provoking comments. So let me start by taking a little bit of time to tell you what I do and where I'm coming from on this, which I think will be useful. So as I said earlier, I work on the adverse impacts of the existing climate change world, well over having impacts around the world. And we mentioned the wildfires in the western coast of the United States. Also in my part of the world, we have floods right now. Part of my country is flooded. A couple of months ago, we had a super cyclone, and all of this in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. So the climate change impacts, in my view, as of 2020, are here. 2020 is the tipping point in which there's no more argument. You have, even in the United States, there's no more argument. It's happening. And 500,000 climate refugees in Oregon as of yesterday. These are climate refugees. They are climate change attributable impacts. And so in this context, working with the most vulnerable communities in some of the most vulnerable countries, particularly a group of countries called the least developed countries, for those of you and your audience who may not be familiar, these are nearly 50 of the poorest countries in Asia and Africa primarily, who are recognized under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as being particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, both because they're poor, have little capacity, at the same time they are geographically located in parts of the world which are going to be impacted by climate change. Now, we do have a governance structure for climate change. It's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And for well over 2.5 decades, it's been meeting every year in an annual conference of parties. We've had agreements in Kyoto and then Paris to do things. The Paris Agreement is particularly important because we agreed on a global temperature goal of 1.5 degrees, which Thelma mentioned earlier. And so we have agreements to do things, but we're not doing them. And that really is the big problem with the current governance structure that we have. We have it, it is a global structure, it is equitable in the sense that poor countries like ours are able to speak, but it's not delivering in terms of doing things that are equitable and supportive. And in particular, if you take the division between the polluters and the victims of pollution, it's a very unequal world. The polluters make the decisions and the victims are left to deal with the problems. And that is in and of itself, as of now, the existing paradigm under which we live. We have very, very little voice, even in a UN Framework Convention, which has, everybody has one vote, but they're not the equal vote. So what scares me the most about this new area of geoengineering or solar radiation management is that whatever little voice we have in the UN Framework Convention might be completely sidelined. And decisions would be made, as Thelma said, by people not being subjected to any kind of global governance at all. And that's why I have, over the last couple of years, started to take an interest in learning about this. And in particular, in order to advise the least developed countries with whom I work, and in the UN framework negotiations, I advised the least developed country group, currently chaired by Bhutan, on the issue of adaptation, and particularly a new and emerging issue, which is loss and damage, which is now happening as we speak. As I said, we are no longer able to anticipate and prepare anymore because climate change is upon us, losses are happening, damage is occurring, and we need to be dealing with that as well. So in this context where we are, even though there is some level of equity in the process, it doesn't result in equitable outcomes. We are extremely worried about new dimensions of actions taking place in the name of solving a problem, but may cause adverse impacts on other people. And I'm extremely wary when anybody uses the word we to mean all of humanity, because we, I'm afraid, does not cover all of humanity. As the Black Lives Matter activists in the United States are insisting on Black Lives Matter, in my case, it's poor people's lives matter. And in general, when these we is invoked to make decisions on behalf of humanity, poor people are not included in that we. It's the rich people making those decisions who are considering themselves to be the we and speak on behalf of all of humanity and take that role themselves. And so I'm extremely wary of that happening, and I want to ensure that it doesn't happen. And the final element, if I can share with you, is that in the least developed countries group, which as I said is about 50 countries in Asia and Africa, we have a network of universities that my center in Dhaka coordinates, and we do a lot of knowledge sharing and working, particularly on adaptation to climate change in vulnerable communities. As I said, that's what our main focus is, but we also want to learn about this. So in my LDC, or Least Developed Countries Universities Consortium on Climate Change, we call it LUCCC, we have initiated a learning process of wanting to learn about this process so that we can look at its pros and cons. We're not taking an anti-stand, but we do want to learn more about it to see whether we can make informed decisions both at a national level as well as at the collective global negotiations level on issues as they emerge in the negotiation context. Thelma talked about the IPCC and the scientific context. We are also interested in that, but more importantly, in the UN Framework Convention, political context is something that interests me and I want to learn more about so that I can advise the governments that I work with on what is the best way forward from their perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Saleem. And we, the organizers of this event, we welcome these thoughts and we'll come back to some of these. But let me turn to Arunabha, because we've heard many different ideas about why these technologies, these approaches might be used. And maybe there are some reasons why certain actors are involved, or they're not involved, or they could be involved. And maybe you could help us to understand what motivations might there be and what incentives might there be in place, or should there be in place to make certain things happen or not happen. So, Arunabha.
Thank you, Janos. And once again, hello, everyone. And it's great to be in this virtual campfire chat and listen in on all these voices coming in on why we are even having this discussion. I'm going to pick up from where Saleem left off. because I think it's very important that we understand the context in which or against which we're having this conversation in the first place. In my introduction, I mentioned that way back in 2010, now it's a whole decade since, I co-chaired a governance working group, international governance working group for the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative. Now remember, 2010, this was happening just a few months after what we could consider the failed climate summit in Copenhagen. So the mood of the world in terms of climate action was certainly not very, very positive. And therefore, one could argue that there was some context to thinking about, do we need to be working on a completely different set of interventions, given that our actions are failing collectively, even though primarily the blame perhaps lies more with the developed part of the world. Now, fast forward a decade, right? A lot of conversation, a lot of research has happened on climate altering technologies, a lot more needs to happen, and a fair amount of conversation has happened on the governance of these technologies. But the context, again, matters. Saleem mentioned the extreme weather events in the United States, in the Bay of Bengal, in Australia, and so forth. But there's another extreme event that has happened, and that's the global pandemic shock. Now, thanks to that, the World Bank estimates that up to 100 million additional people would slip back into extreme poverty. And it would reverse, this current pandemic shock would reverse about 3 years of global development. Now, you could argue, well, how bad is 3 years? You know, you've been poor for so long, you can wait 3 years longer. But actually, what it underscores is that you cannot, and I'm going to say it once again, you cannot play around with people living at the margins. Because the smallest of shocks, let alone planetary shocks, can completely disrupt their ways of life and their ways of livelihood. And anything we consider has to be contextualized against what it would mean for the most vulnerable. Let me give you another example. Wimbledon took on pandemic insurance about a decade and a half ago. Therefore, this summer, although it couldn't host the championships, it's going to get a return on its insurance of $141 million. Now, the World Bank's pandemic insurance bonds, which were introduced about 2 or 3 years ago, collectively for all the low-income countries, is going to disburse $132 million. Wimbledon, $141 million. All poor countries, $132 million in terms of pandemic insurance. Again, why am I saying this? Because we talk about governance as if our intentions were good enough that the world would automatically become a better place. The reality is not that. The reality is that the world is unequal, that resources are unequally deployed, resources are unequally used, and the impacts of our choices are unequally distributed. Which is why the reason I'm still in this conversation 10 years on is that I am interested in designing governance architectures that responds to the intentions. Why are you even looking to work on this stuff? You cannot have governance that would automatically emerge in existential vacuums. And I don't believe you can design governance architectures that exist in moral vacuums. So what do we need to think about? Question number one in my mind is, why are we considering climate altering technologies? Question number two is, what are the incentives different countries, different we's might have? And question number three for me is, who might these different we's be? And governance architecture has to be designed accordingly. So let me spend just a couple more minutes and then keep quiet. Why are we considering? It is true, our collective climate action is nowhere near keeping temperature rise to 1.5 C's above pre-industrial levels. And therefore, one could argue that climate altering technologies, even though, as Simon mentioned very clearly, belong in different buckets, could be a last resort to our failed efforts. But that raises the question in my mind, are our efforts strong enough to fail in the first place? And therefore, are we looking at these technologies as first resorts because we are not taking the harder, not doing the harder things of mitigating emissions as fast as they need to be mitigated? Is our investment in climate altering technologies or research in them an effort for us to buy time? The Thelma's very clear enunciation that some of the pathways will result in an overshoot. And therefore, if we invested in these technologies, we could perhaps buy that time during which there's the overshoot, because we know we can drag the curve back down into negative emissions territory. Or are we thinking about this in terms of responses to localized emergencies? So if we are particularly concerned about the Arctic, so do we think about climate altering technologies that can restore ice levels in the Arctic, regardless of what it might do for tropical monsoons? Therefore comes the question of incentives. Are we thinking about these technologies because they're relatively cheaper, at least by some estimates? Or slightly more Machiavellian, is it a signal that if the rest of the we does not get its act together, we are going to keep, whoever the we is going to keep investing in these technologies? So the signal to nudge more traditional climate mitigation behavior. Is the incentive to take a technological lead in carbon removal technologies, for instance, because one is anticipating a carbon market in future where I can make a lot of money? Or is my only incentive that I am alone? No one cares about my small island state. It's sinking, and therefore I'm going to use my sovereignty to welcome scientists to do something here because no one else seems to bother. And therefore the who is this we, varies between privately funded research among small groups of scientists or research consortia that might be formed among small groups of countries that have advanced scientific capability. Or maybe we create an international platform, many countries come together. Or again, as Thelma and I think even Amy mentioned, the risk of unilateral action. A single country or single subnational province even suggests we have the authority and the sovereignty and the ability to do this. Or could it be a desperate province, a desperate small island state that says we are the we that wants to invest? Until we unpack, without a priori imposing our value judgments on them, until we unpack these questions, why, with what incentives, and who constitutes the we will keep thinking about governance in these existential vacuums, in these moral vacuums, without understanding the context against which the most vulnerable on the planet are already seeing their lives turning backwards and facing prospects that our inaction will make it far, far worse for them.
Thank you, Arunabha. And there's lots of interesting ideas here. And at this point, I just want to remind our participants, please put up your questions. I see a few already appearing. Please put your questions on the Q&A section of the Zoom application. If it's directed to any individual, say so. If not, then we'll see who can best respond. Now, lots of interesting ideas have been raised here, and maybe some of you, the speakers, may have some reactions to what somebody else said. So I'd like to start with that. I'd like to ask all of you to turn on your microphone so that we can have an easy exchange without having to always switch on and off. Just raise your hand or start saying something if you have a particular comment. I see Saleem already raising his hand, so please go ahead. Let's have a discussion, and then we'll turn to some questions that the participants may have. So, Saleem, and then I see
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Janos, and thank you to all the speakers. I think I'm finding this extremely interesting. I have a question that I'd like to explore with Amy, if I might, with regards to her formulation of moving from the analog to the digital world. And I think this is really something worth exploring in more detail. And let me share a little bit of my experience sitting in Dhaka in Bangladesh over the last few months under the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions, lockdown, working from home. Now, in Bangladesh, we're one of the poorest countries, one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, 160 million people living in less than 150,000 square kilometers. But we almost have 100% mobile coverage in this country. Almost everybody has a mobile phone, and many, many of them have smartphones as well. And the transition to moving into this digital world, I live in a Zoom world now rather than in a real world, has been very, very quick. We've taken to it. In Bangladesh, I'm having meetings with colleagues in Dhaka with whom, it took me an hour in traffic to go and meet in the old days. Now we meet on Zoom all the time. And so we have taken to this digital technology and world very, very quickly, I must say, and surprisingly in my view. And one of the things that we do a lot of is work with some of the most vulnerable communities. And what we are doing is enabling them to bring their voices out. And we call it Voices from the Front Lines. And we have a program now where we have blogs and videos and conversations of voices from the front lines, not just in Bangladesh, but in other least developed countries, as I mentioned earlier, where we're trying to connect them. And the connectivity across the world is now something that is available, that we are able to talk to each other and manage to do this. And so I see this as a great opportunity that I would love to find out more about how does one make this happen more rapidly and quickly, and add to that more level playing field, if you like, in terms of knowledge and participation in global discussions than we've had in the past. In the past, we'd all have to fly to the COP and be there. So thousands of people would go there, good thing, but not everybody could do that. But on an online platform, we can have much, much greater levels of discussion and participation. And there's something I am very interested in exploring how we can do that. And I'd love to hear from Amy what her thoughts on, or how do we make this happen? Thank you.
Just a second. Thelma, your question is related to this? If not, then I would appreciate if Amy could quickly respond, or...
No, it's not related to this, so you can have Amy.
Okay, Amy, go ahead then, please.
Well, great to hear your thoughts on this, Saleem. I mean, one of the focuses of the work that we've been involved in with the last couple of years with our building out the Sustainability and Digital Age initiative has been to say, how do we think about those things? If for example, if we sat down today and we said, how are we going to govern the world? Climate risks, move the world to a low carbon world, zero carbon world. It would look nothing like what we are today with a UN structure. It would be much more distributed. It would be much more agile. There'd be much more voices. Now, getting from where we are now to that world, we have our structures now. And it's not that they're not useful, but we do need to not just bring in some digital technologies and say, let's do what we used to do with these new things. That's not how the business was transformed. They said, let's break that box. And let's think about it in a different way. And I think that's where we are today. That's not to say there's not huge challenges. We got to deal with a lot of issues, but that's one of the focuses of this initiative, is to say, you know what? Today, humanity is increasingly interdependent on and through both the digital and natural worlds. And so the agendas of building a safe and trusted and equitable digital world, I think, is interconnected to this, to tackling our sustainability challenges. And part of that is these issues of getting more voices from the bottom up for deliberative governance to address these issues, and getting the information there so that we can understand those trade-offs at a massive scale. And that means not just having connectivity around the world, it also means making sure that the incentives are right to get the right data so that we can have the understanding, because right now a lot of those incentives aren't to get the information for addressing those equitable issues. But we need to develop the public-private partnerships so we can do that, so we can force those questions really up front. And I think that we're really at a tip, and this moment right now with COVID is driving that even further. We're going to be pushed to making those decisions. And so, like so many of those things, it could push us the wrong way, but if we work together, I think it can really be an opportunity for transformative change. So love.
Janos, can I jump in quickly?
Yes, please, Simon. You.
This is a fantastic conversation, and I appreciate Amy's nuanced response to this very important question from Saleem. I'd just like to connect the themes that Arunabha brought into the conversation. I'm reminded with any conversation about technology, there's this old quote from poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, something like, "Machines are in the saddle and ride mankind." That sometimes we can imagine that technology is driving the agenda, and that technology will take us to places that humans have no control over. And that notion has haunted my engagement with the entire climate altering technologies landscape, as we imagine that there are straightforward technological responses to what are actually very complex social challenges. Climate change is not just greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Climate change are the social conditions that drive carbon out of the ground and set it on fire and lead to global warming. And so, Amy, in your response, you're saying we need to look at all of these things in a connected fashion. Artificial intelligence, emerging digital technologies of all kinds that offer great opportunities, but there's also the danger, unless we're attendant to the who is in the conversation and to what ends these technologies are directed, we just end up baking in the very challenges, the social conditions that gave us climate change in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just respond to that quickly?
A quick one, and then I don't want to go to Thelma, but please go ahead. Amy.
I guess because I really want to highlight that my approach to thinking about these issues of the role of the technologies isn't, that the technologies themselves can solve all the problems. The way I think about it often is in the context of Marshall McLuhan's, what's attributed to Marshall McLuhan often is, we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us. These tools are shaping our society and shaping our future, whether we like it or not. And so what I think we need to do is recognize that that's such a powerful force for transformative change. And Saleem, I think, highlighted some of that it's changing so quickly, and recognize that and steer that as a really powerful tool for where we want to be, including which at the center has to be equity issues. Nature is our base, and equity has to be at the center of solving these places. And if we use these tools to shape that world that we want in a conscious way, I think it could be transformative.
Thank you. Thelma, you had some thought earlier.
Yes, turning a little bit the subject, and if you allow me, I think it's important for us to contextualize a little bit this discussion. We're talking about governance, and now I think that I flagged some elements in my first intervention. But I think that when the Paris Agreement was decided and ratified very quickly, it brought a completely new dimension to the discussion that now makes it important to start talking more seriously about these climate altering approaches. Not necessarily only, as Simon has said, SRM, CDR, other options as well. Each one having their own implications, risks, impacts, opportunities. So it's a whole portfolio. But why I want to say that? Because I also want to flag the aim of the Paris Agreement, being well below the 2 degrees Celsius, but pursuing efforts, to limit global warming to the global temperature to 1.5, right? Above pre-industrial levels. And why that's important? Because the messages that we had in the special report was every warming matters. So a different world at 1.5 and 2. Every year matters. So the more we delay actions, the worse it is, right? And also every action matters as well. So anyway, I wanted to contextualize, to say that all the assessed emission pathways that IPCC did for the special report, they all by around 2050, the CO2 emissions were reduced to net zero globally. I'm going to repeat that. In all assessed pathways, which were several, some with no overshoot, some with limited overshoot, and higher overshoot. In all of them, right? The CO2 emissions would be reduced globally to net zero by around 2050. And obviously, we know that that might not be completely feasible. And this is why we will need to help to achieve that and ensure that we could, go into a 1.5 consistent pathway. Janos, I think that it's important to say that obviously we are looking into the no overshoot scenarios which rely less on climate altering options or approaches can be achieved if we do rapid decarbonization. IPCC says it's not impossible to get to the 1.5, but we need transformations in all the sectors. We are talking transformation in energy, transformation in the industrial processes, agriculture, land use, the way we treat the whole thing, including human behavior. So when we are talking about contextualizing this, it depends very much on how we do things. So start now, you start ambitious, trying to reach decarbonization as much as we can. Okay, so we understand that that's not completely feasible. We will need to help compensate or offset the residual CO2 emissions by around 2050, that could not be zero. And also we already flagged the need for the negative emissions, or those that will bring higher overshoot pathways back to 1.5. So we are flagging this now. So this is, I think, contextualize a little bit the situation of why we are talking so much about, these things now, more than we did in the past. Because in the past, we didn't have the 1.5, concern or aim of the Paris Agreement. So have we been talking about governance on these issues? We haven't been talking about governance of these issues. And I think that Saleem mentioned one interesting point, that IPCC and the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, we are different bodies. One is scientific, another one is political. But, but the IPCC feeds scientific information for this discussion, which has helped many of the decisions, including to be below 2 degrees Celsius, because IPCC indicated already the risk, in particular for the least developing countries, vulnerable regions of the world, all of which will be or can be severely affected by climate change. So, it's the role of IPCC into bringing these issues is absolutely relevant and supports and feeds into the decision-making process at the UNFCCC. I think that a lot has been said about the we. Who are we? Who takes the decisions? Climate Change Convention is potentially a good institutional arrangement that could focus on that. But I was going to complement, just to finish, Janos. I may be wrong, but the only piece of governance, international governance on this issue, came from the Convention of Biological Diversity many years ago, when it raised the concern, and if I'm not mistaken, it was ocean fertilization specifically, or options that could have negative impacts in biodiversity. So that is really flagging the overall concerns, because convention means you have several hundreds of countries engaged, right? So that is something that you do by consensus. So by consensus, that concern was raised. And I think that it should be raised broader than just, for that specific biodiversity issue. Janos, I would like to comment on Amy's points, but I think that I have to give voice to others that want to speak as well.
Okay.
So I'll stop. If you have time. I would like to come back to the permanent saturation issue and the role of large-scale reforestation, large-scale deployment of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, the safety of sites for storage, which is a concern that everybody has, not so much on permanence, but on that. But with all the fires that are occurring, all the extreme events that climate change is bringing with it, in addition to the natural variability, which already adds to these, I think that we have to think carefully if these options, not solutions, even nature-based solutions, I call them options, if the options are really good options to put us on track. Thank you.
Thank you, Thelma, and maybe we can come back to some of these issues, but I would like to turn to some of the questions. We now have a few questions coming from the participants, and in fact, the first one is very much along the lines of what you just started talking about. And just to give you a break so you can relax for a second, Thelma, maybe Arunabha or Simon might wish to address that, and then happy to have you come back in. But Doreen Stabinski, one of our participants, asked, and I quote here, "The permanence requirements for dealing with removals of fossil carbon are far greater than most of the current conversations reflect. The need is for centuries of storage, not decades. What are the implications for governance of removals?" So, you know, you just started it, so maybe Arunabha or Simon, you can continue, and then let's see if we can address this properly. And then look forward to, we'll come back with some more questions. So, Arunabha?
Okay, I'll take a shot. I mean, I agree with the question. I'm not sure I have the right answer, but the point is, the fact that we are thinking about carbon removal in a manner that would last for centuries, not just decades, should not, in my opinion, lead to a presumption that we cannot imagine governance systems that also cannot last that long. And now that sounds a little ridiculous because, you know, we are just 75 years since the end of the Second World War. So what is our governance architecture? It's less than a century old. But hang on. There are governances, again, as I started, is a contextualized kind of pathway, a contextualized sort of arena within which we moderate and manage our interactions. There are corporations in the world that have lasted for much longer, right? Which have lasted for centuries. They've evolved, their names have changed, their directors have changed, etc. They might have belonged to one country initially, then the country's political boundaries changed, but the corporation kept moving on. Why am I saying this? It's simply because it is possible. It is possible for humans, and I'm now collectively calling all of us as the we, to conceptualize rules and norms, formal rules and customary norms that can actually stay or evolve beyond our imagined lifetimes. However, it should be modular enough, nimble enough to evolve. And I just want to take a minute to respond or bring in something that both Simon and Amy mentioned. Simon talked about in his own opening remarks, talked about while there are a number of different ways in which we can think about climate altering technologies, we should not only evaluate them in climate terms. And Amy, you know, added on to this by saying among the three specific issues that we need to consider, the most, well, she didn't say most important, but I take it as the most important, is the question of trade-offs. So when we are contextualizing, a lot of the literature one comes across on climate altering technologies is this cheap? But cheap against what metric? Yes, cheap against another way of mitigating carbon. But is it cheap when we consider the impact on biodiversity? Is this cheap when we consider the impact of perhaps loss of agricultural output? Is it cheap when we consider loss of jobs? When we start thinking about issues in a little bit more aggregated way, I think, again, it was Amy who said it should at least have some relevance to what the rest of the SDGs, how the rest of the SDGs are impacted. Then perhaps some of the technologies we're considering are not the cheapest, and something else, especially again coming out of the pandemic or trying to come out of that pandemic, we have to be thinking about Where can we get jobs? Where can we create growth? And what can be sustainable? And can we square that impossible trinity? Right. So number one, to respond to the question, I think it is possible to imagine modular, decentralized, distributed governance systems that will evolve as the context changes. But it is a value judgment on our part to determine the boundaries of that context. And the more limited we make those boundaries, the less responsive and relevant and salient will be the governance architecture.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I tack on
Yes,
just very quickly to that, Janos?
Please.
Thanks. In governance conversations, we can talk about the world as it is, or we can talk about the world as it might be wished to be. In the world as it is, this longevity question about carbon storage suggests that there must be a place for technological carbon removal options that put carbon deep under the ground. Because this is the only fashion in the world as it is that it could be ensured that carbon would remain in storage over the long term, because forests burn, because forest land use can be changed, because soils can be plowed to bring carbon back into the atmosphere if it's stored there. In the world as it might be imagined to be, as it might be wished to be, this is an opportunity to think about the sorts of forms of governance that Arunabha is speaking to. This conversation about carbon removal can lead us to imagine different ways of being together in the world over the long term. And that's an exciting proposition. But let's not kid ourselves that at the moment, right, with systems of power as they are in the world, it is going to be hard to make that step, given the longevity questions that we have.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to another question. There were a couple of questions that link to, including from anonymous participants, but about existing government frameworks. Thelma, you mentioned that the CBD did something. It's true, but it's not the only one. There was also the London Convention, London Protocol. But the question is really about which processes, international treaties prohibit some of these actions or govern them. And I'd like to link this to the earlier discussion that we had a little bit, because I thought one of the most interesting parts of the introductory statement was the focus on land. How many of these actions, particularly the ones that one might do in the short term, link to land, and therefore the people who live on the land. So what international treaties, governance frameworks does one have to actually address this? I don't know which one of you would like to tackle this, but it seems to me those are relevant questions. There are a few others, but I'll come back to those questions afterwards. Any one of you would like to react to this? Thelma, go ahead.
No, quick.
And
right?
then Arunabha.
I think it's important to have around. Obviously, we have already, identified the Climate Change Convention, in particular the subsidiary body of scientific and technological advice within the Climate Change Convention as a potential forum. You could have UN Environment, you could have WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, but you could have the biodiversity or the Convention of Biological Diversity. The only issue that I raise, Janos, is this big, institutional arrangements, international, that allow a broader, equitable participation of all the members, right? Takes time. Because they have to do it by consensus. Sometimes the language is encrypted, as I call it. It's not clear enough. Or they decide on something and then they have to elaborate, years to come, obviously based on sciences that they normally do. So that is the only, let's say, bottleneck that I find. It has positive elements because it engages more people. It's a more equitable participation. I like that a lot. But at the same time, it takes more time than we possibly have.
I had Arunabha, but just before you react, Arunabha, I actually forgot to mention one important part of the question, because there were a couple of questions I tried to pull together, and I think it was from Shika Bashin, that is there any agreement, treaty, or some kind of statement that actually internationally that encourages some of these emerging technologies? We talked a lot about control and regulation, but is there anything out there that is encouraging? But anyway, you had some thoughts, so react to either of part of the question.
Well, let me try and answer Shikha's part first and then come back to the last question. As far as I know, the answer is no. However, you know, at UNEA 4, the UN Environment Assembly, fourth UN Environment Assembly, a proposition was put forward by Switzerland and about 10 other countries to evaluate the status of these technologies, and that proposal failed in the assembly. But had it gone through, one could have argued that an assessment of the status of the science and the status of the interlinkages and the impacts, etc., could at one level have been interpreted as prohibitive and restrictive, or at another level could have been interpreted as enabling. And this is why I'm now going to come back to the earlier part of that question. This is why intentions matter. Unless we are exploring not just impacts as they are observable, but the intentions behind them, we don't know how to enable the moves that are sort of more positive and sort of mitigate or pull back on intentions that are more adverse or malign. In terms of land, you know, we have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but there were two other conventions that came together in 1992. And, you know, they tend to be the sort of cousins or stepchildren, etc., of UNFCCC. We hear a lot about the Convention on Biological Diversity, which did impose a moratorium on climate altering technologies if it had an impact on biodiversity. But there's also the UN Convention on Combating Desertification. Now, on one hand, you know, the Amy put the choice very starkly before us. You know, what are we going to use our land for? Are we going to use it for growing crops or growing trees or growing certain types of trees that absorb a lot of carbon? And these are not just technological choices, these are ethical choices that we have to make. Now, similarly, under UNCCD, we have a number of ideas around restoring more degraded land. The Bond Challenge looks at up to 350 million hectares of restored land by 2030. So the land question does matter, but where I'm not sure that any of these entities or these platforms or these forums work is that they explicitly put the ethics of it in front of them. So you're still evaluating it against a number, a metric. So have we got pledges for 350 million hectares of restoration of degraded land? But what would be the methods of restoration? With what trees? Native species, invasive species? To absorb carbon or do something else? To do restorative, regenerative agriculture for small farmers? Or to do large plots of land to absorb carbon and store it away somewhere else? These are ethical choices. They're not technological moves alone. And my belief is that while we imagine technological interventions at a planetary scale, we haven't yet come up with the governance architecture or even the governance conversation platforms, notwithstanding campfire chats like this, to have ethical conversations at a planetary scale.
Fantastic. I'd like to address one question to Amy, partly because I think she can respond to this, but also because she needs to leave 5 minutes before we end because of some other important assignment. But before posting that question, just one more line of response to this is that the CBD has provided guidance to governments under what conditions there could or couldn't be engagement on these kind of technologies, but it also provided positive signal that there is need for transdisciplinary research in this area. So it's not just about deployment, it's also about research and getting more knowledge. But Amy, over to you. What one question that has been asked is, what are the prospects for private sector research and development in this space? And what are the ramifications of that? Any thoughts that you could share with us on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Something I think about quite a bit. I want to respond to Arunabha though, because I think that the last point he made is really an important one. This issue that I don't want to, you said it much more eloquently than I did, but the issue that we don't have a platform to think at a global scale about these ethical issues. And I really think that that's sort of at the core of this idea of we got to reimagine our global environmental governance, right? We're dealing with different types of problems. We are dealing with a changing landscape. Simon, you mentioned, you know, the governance of today versus the governance of tomorrow, the structures of tomorrow. But I think you presented it as the world we want tomorrow. I think there's another part of the world is changing so rapidly, whether we want it to or not. So there's that other context of it. And I think shifting it so that we can have those ethical conversations in that context is really important. And linking that then, Janos, to your question about private sector, I actually think a key part of actually addressing that, of being able to think about what that, building that global platform for having these ethical discussions has to be in the context of public-private people partnerships, where we really think about developing transdisciplinary research across those different scales, and research and innovation in both technology and science of understanding what's happening, and in, you know, social and ethical issues and standards and what we should be doing. What are the strategies? So when I think of innovation, it's not just technology innovation, it's innovation in how we do things, how we work together, how we drive social change, how we build social movements. And what better time to think about those things when we are all in such a disruptive state and thinking about where do we go from here. And so I think that those types of public-private partnership, public-private people partnerships are really something that we need to do. And I think that there are companies that are beginning to do that. You know, I think Microsoft is really leaning in some of these issues as it's leaned forward and making some really aggressive targets, but also working with communities around the world to say they not only have to do it in their company, but also work to direct their resources to work with partners around the world to actually help others also achieve those goals. So I think that there are lots of opportunities there.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for your participation. In case you need to leave,
I'll leave in a few minutes. Yeah.
For the rest of your day. But I'd like to stick to the ethical and moral questions, partly because our C2G initiative is part of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. So this is part of our broader business, of course. And the question is where these ethical issues can be considered at the global level, or how ethical and moral considerations can be introduced into existing processes. So coming to Duncan McLaren's question is very concretely, if the importance of the moral dimension is there and the participation of the most vulnerable is something that we are concerned about, then in which institutions do the panelists think governance of these approaches should be developed, and why? Current institutions or future institutions that don't exist, either way, please. Any reactions?
So let me give it a go, Janos. So
Yes,
I mentioned earlier that the existing structures that we have for governance on climate change is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the nearest to equitable global governance that we have, given that, you know, there is no global government that can apply laws across all countries. It is very much a system of voluntary compliance. We make agreements, and then we either abide by those agreements or don't abide by them, and there's no consequence for not abiding. And we have a long history of that in the UN Framework Convention. So it is certainly an extremely imperfect governance system, but it's the best we've got. And so to me, anything that tries to bypass that, and there have been attempts to do that, you know, under President Bush, there was an attempt to get all the major emitters together and solve the problem with a smaller number of countries who are the ones that would decide what to do, didn't really work. And it certainly excluded the rest of us from that meeting. So anything that is exclusive and leaves people out, and I take Thelma's point, it is always more cumbersome, more time consuming if you want to have a more democratic governance structure. But to me, that is well worth doing it the right way rather than trying to take shortcuts and doing it the wrong way, particularly being, from the victim's point of view, we are, if we're not at the table, we're part of the dinner, as they say.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Sam. That's very helpful. Now we have time for one more question, and then I think we'll have to close. So I'd like to go to Hugh Hunt's question, and he says on the issue of unilateral deployment, what of scale? Small-scale tree planting in my garden is of course fine, but how do we define the scale above which CDR, carbon dioxide removal, requires governance? Anybody would like to tackle that?
One short answer to the question is that Hugh's trees may be governed. If we think about the enabling environment that could be established by, in Hugh's case, the UK government to try and aggregate tree planting up to some piece of the commitment to international climate targets. And so that's why we need to think about carbon removal alongside the rest of the climate change agenda. And we need countries to aggregate at the international level what climate response looks like. And then that needs to filter down to particular things in particular places. So if Hugh's getting credit from his local or federal government for looking after that tree after he's planted it for carbon terms, then even that kind of very small act in one's backyard is going to be part of governance of these technologies.
Okay, and Arunabha has a thought on that as well.
Just to add, I think Simon has given a great way in which the accounting of that could be at a global scale, even if the action is small. I have perhaps a cruder metric, because this issue of threshold, so what is the scale? Is this a laboratory experiment? Is this an outdoor experiment? Is this a large-scale experiment? Is this deployment? We've been wrestling with that question for a while. To me, the crude metric, crude rule of thumb is, if you're imagining any intervention that is going to have planetary impact, it requires planetary scale conversation. If your intervention is not going to have planetary impact, it could be in that spectrum of various activities that we could then bucket together as climate altering, etc. But the specific intervention only gets relevance and when the scale you need to deploy at is the minimum scale with which you can have planetary impact. And that is where, again, we need to think about governance also as a spectrum, not an either or between no governance and world government, but between self-imposed norms that scientists have to regulate themselves, national research rules and norms that national governments impose, and then transparency of anything that is going beyond that, along with dealing with existing platforms, using existing platforms to deal with the monitoring, evaluation, and enforcement of any disputes that emerge. Governance is also a spectrum based on the minimum level of intervention you need to have the impact you desire.
Thank you, Arunabha. And I think that's a good point on which to stop. In fact, we have come to the end of our time, and we need a scale of governance. It's not a simple this or that, but a range of different responses that will be required at different levels. At different times, may I add, because the different technologies, different systems will require different actions at different times. So with that, I would like to thank our 5 speakers, including Amy, who had to leave, as I mentioned, Thelma, Saleem, Arunabha, and Simon. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the participants. And we'll see you at the next Campfire Chat or webinar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.